webinar series for the month of April 2021. The pre-conference webinars are designed to highlight the need to accelerate adaptation in today's uncertain times. The April edition of our webinar series will focus on the Science for Adaptation policy briefs that have recently been launched by the World Adaptation Science Programme. Today's webinar on transboundary climate risk and adaptation is part of the WASP Science Policy Brief series, convened to support researchers, policymakers, and practitioners to further their knowledge and capacity and underpin effective adaptation to climate change. I'll make a few housekeeping announcements before we begin. So today's webinar is being recorded and is also being streamed live on YouTube, the link to which will be shared in our chat box by my colleagues. And we welcome you to revisit the content yourself and share it with your colleagues. The webinar will run for 2 hours, and during this time, we request the audience to please keep their cameras switched off and mics muted at all times. Attendees are encouraged to post questions in the Q&A and chat box at any point during the webinar. And while these will be taken up and addressed during the designated Q&A session, speakers can also answer these through the chat box. We will be sharing the link to an online form in the chat box that is designed to help WASP identify new research directions, and I invite all attendees to kindly fill it out. We will also be sharing a link in our chat box for you to access the Science for Adaptation policy briefs, and please also feel free to circulate the same among your colleagues. Moving on to our session today, first off, we have a special address by Dr. Anand Patwardhan, Professor, University of Maryland, and Co-Chair Science Committee WASP, and the Chair of the Science Committee of Adaptation Futures. Dr. Patwardhan is a professor in the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland, College Park. He was earlier a professor at the Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay. His research focuses on mitigation and adaptation responses to climate change, the assessment of vulnerability and adaptation, as well as broader issues of science, technology, and innovation policy. He has been a coordinating lead author for the IPCC and a member of the Scientific and Technical Advisory Panel of the Global Environmental Facility. He is currently serving as the Research Director for the Global Commission on Adaptation. Over to you, Dr. Patwardhan.
Thank you very much, Dhriti, and a very good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone on this call. Real pleasure to me here and share a few words at the opening of this webinar, what promises to be a really interesting set of discussions on a very important topic. As Dhriti mentioned, the Adaptation Futures Conference series is one of the flagship activities of the World Adaptation Science Programme, or WASP. WASP is an international science program that works across the science policy practice interface in adaptation with a wide range of membership from different stakeholder organizations and a number of sponsor organizations, including the United Nations Environment Programme, the UNFCCC Secretariat, which I see is here, and I see Annette from the UNFCCC Secretariat here, which is great. The Green Climate Fund, the World Meteorological Organization, IPCC, and of course, the Global Environment Facility. So what WASP's mandate is to advance both the development and the application and use of knowledge and science to support action. So really, as I said, playing in that science policy practice interface as a bridge organization. And the science policy briefs, one of which you're about to hear today and be discussed in this webinar, are a critical instrument of that process. The science policy briefs are meant to highlight the state of knowledge on topics that appear to be of significance and importance for the policy and action context, and are trying to advance both the knowledge, but also try and make it accessible to a wide range of stakeholders. So these science policy briefs, we've had 3 of them in our first round, launched last year, dealing with adaptation tools and decision tools, dealing with high-end climate scenarios, and dealing, of course, with transboundary climate risks. We had a webinar on one of them yesterday, and the transboundary risks are being covered today. This is an ongoing process of the WASP. We are, in fact, now engaged in an active process to launch the next set of briefs, which will address early warning systems. We also look at the global goal on adaptation. So this is an ongoing process that WASP intends to carry on, and we would be, of course, happy to get your feedback on priorities in areas that we might wish to target. Adaptation Futures, as I said, is a flagship activity of WASP. We are very happy that this, even though because of the pandemic, we were not able to hold it last year in April. This is in fact the first 1 year, exactly a year ago at this time, we would have been actually in Adaptation Futures 2020 in Delhi. But we are looking forward to hosting it later this year in October in Delhi. And my many thanks to the TERI team for really having kept up the momentum and for having continued the process of engagement all through this very difficult and unusual situation in which we have found ourselves. And I must really appreciate their efforts in continuing this. And I hope that we will continue to build our resilience, not just to the pandemic, but also obviously using that as a springboard to a more resilient future. So with that, again, a very warm welcome to everyone here for this webinar, and I'll turn back to Dhriti. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anand. To begin today's session, we have Ms. Katie Harris, Senior Policy Fellow at the Stockholm Environment Institute and Director of Adaptation Without Borders. At the Stockholm Environment Institute, her work focuses on the global governance of climate change adaptation. She is also the Director of Adaptation Without Borders, which is a new global partnership building systemic resilience and international cooperation on adaptation to manage the cross-border and cascading effects of climate change. I now invite Ms. Harris to commence with our panel discussion today.
Thank you so much, Dhriti and Anand. Thank you very much. And it's a great delight to echo their warm welcome to everyone joining us today for this 2-hour session on transboundary climate risk and adaptation. This event is co-hosted by TERI and the World Adaptation Science Programme, as you've just heard, with the support of the Horizon 2020 Project Cascades, the MISTRA Geopolitics Research Programme, the Stockholm Environment Institute, and Adaptation Without Borders, which you've just heard is a new global partnership that is working to strengthen international cooperation on adaptation, convened by SCI, ODI and IDRI alongside a growing number of partners from around the world. We've got a really fantastic panel lined up to share their thoughts and insights with you today, but I know we also have a great wealth of experience from those in the audience. And I was in a dialogue this morning as part of the UN Food Systems Summit preparations, and we were encouraged to listen to each other with big ears. And I thought that was a really lovely way of putting it. And over the next 2 hours, I would also encourage us to speak openly in what we aim to create a safe space to share what we both do and don't know about this new and emerging agenda. So please do post your questions, whether they're large or small, in the Q&A box throughout the webinar, but also share your thoughts and reflections and experiences in the chat box too. We really want to hear them. We may not well be answering them as we go, but we do have a dedicated session, at least half an hour today, and my colleague Frida Lager and I will be keeping an eye on them throughout the session, and then raising and addressing them through this dedicated Q&A session in the agenda. And do remember to tell us your name and your organisation if you're happy to when you're posting that comment or question. There is also going to be some conversations going on social media, so do follow them there and contribute yourself using the handle @AdaptFutures and also the hashtag Adaptation Without Borders. So let me just say a couple of words before we begin. I think among the many things that we can reflect on in light of our experiences over the last year, it's that we live in an interconnected world, and our fates as such are inescapably intertwined. Our connections to each other expose us to the transboundary nature of risk. It doesn't stop at national borders. And the same is true from the impacts of climate change. While they may be directly experienced in one country, it doesn't mean that their effects end there. They can ripple out across countries or continents, or flow through less tangible but no less real channels that connect countries thousands of miles apart. And the same is true for our adaptation actions. Adaptation is not inherently benign. It can redistribute vulnerability. It can create or magnify risk for others, especially across borders. What's good for some is not necessarily what's good for all. And that's what we're here to discuss today over the next couple of hours, the transboundary nature of climate risk and its implications for future research agendas, for adaptation programming, for UNFCCC policy, and for global governance more broadly. And we've got a really fantastic panel lined up to deliver some short reflections on those different areas. So we have Magnus Benzi, who's a research fellow with the Stockholm Environment Institute. We have Prabhakar SBRK, who's a research manager at the Institute for Global Environmental Studies. We have Hannah Kanepan, who's a policy officer with the European Centre for Development Policy. We have Annette Mona, team lead adaptation division of the Climate Change Secretariat of the UNFCCC. And we have Reinhard Meckler, lead of the Systemic Risk and Resilience Group at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. So we'll hear from our panelists some thoughts and contributions in these different areas. Then we'll turn to your questions and comments as audience members. And as I said, please just keep posting them as we go. And then before we come to an end, we'll hear some final reflections from Richard Klein, who's a senior research fellow here at SEI and also member of the Science Committee of the World Adaptation Science Programme. And we hope once our 2 hours are up that you feel better informed about transboundary climate risks, better equipped to account for them in your work, and hopefully also inspired to continue these important conversations about why we need greater international collaboration on adaptation and the benefits that this could realise. So without further ado, let's begin our panel with our panel's reflections. And as I mentioned, we're going to start with Magnus Benzi, who is a research fellow at SEI with over 15 years of experience in climate change research. Magnus, can you give us an introduction to transboundary climate risks? What are they? What are some of their implications for adaptation? And ultimately, what is it about this topic that gets you out of bed in the morning? You have 7 or 8 minutes to answer those questions.
Thanks, Katie. Welcome, everyone. As Katie said, I'll be introducing the topic, and then I work on this topic across a number of projects and in different areas, but I'll be speaking now about the policy brief that we wrote for the WASP series, the first series, and this brief on transboundary climate risk and adaptation is policy brief number 2 in that series. And I'll start with an example.
We seem to have lost you, Magnus. I can't hear you anymore. Perhaps others can.
Okay, for some reason I think I went back on. Nice to be back with you all. Starting with an example from 2010, which is when a disruption to the jet stream caused simultaneous climate impacts in different parts of the world that ended up being connected in a way that I'll try and explain now. So there was a heat wave experienced in Russia, which had severe impacts on cereal production and led to drastic falls in wheat harvests, which was a trigger for the Russian government to ban exports of wheat. At the same time, the same climate phenomenon, which it's been analysed later, is very closely linked to increased greenhouse gas concentrations. So this is a real impact of climate change, led to increased severe precipitation in Pakistan, which created flooding events that itself disrupted agriculture. So this one and the same climate impact led to simultaneous impacts in different parts of the world, one triggering an export ban on wheat and the other impacting food production and leading to food-related riots in Pakistan. At the same time, food prices in distant countries, even high-income countries like the UK, were affected, and this played a role in exacerbating food poverty and triggered the creation of emergency food banks to help low-income families to afford their weekly supermarket shops and to ensure that those on low income had enough food. And these simultaneous climate impacts that we can see from this diagram were caused by the same initial climate change trigger, intense blocking of the anticyclone, and that led to heat waves and excess flooding, like I said. And the initial impacts of those were yield declines, but they triggered subsequent impacts at the global market scale. So there were serial shortfalls on the global market, which led to panic buying by other countries, which in turn further increased the cereal price on the market. And this was a factor that drove the riots in Pakistan, and another factor that drove the affordability crisis in the UK. So this example just shows how both climate impacts happen simultaneously, but their effects also cross borders and even operate at the global scale by affecting markets and driving reactions and adaptations that themselves further exacerbate risk. So this is what we mean by transboundary climate risk. It has two dimensions. One is the impacts of climate change that cross national borders. And the other important one that Katie mentioned earlier is that adaptation itself can have effects that cascade and cross borders and drive risk in some cases. And so we end our brief by making the point that the whole idea that adaptation can be done in isolation is hard to accept in this interconnected world that we live in. But that is the assumption behind a lot of the research and the practice and planning that we currently do on adaptation, that countries are isolated and they can successfully adapt on their own without considering the impact from overseas or the effects of their own adaptation on overseas. But at the same time, recognizing this dimension of risk can inject new momentum into how we cooperate and how we negotiate and how we finance and implement adaptation at different scales. So it raises opportunities as well. And the brief itself highlights 4 key messages that I'll just go through. Firstly, to address the existing accepted wisdom that adaptation is a local phenomenon and a local process. Of course it is, but it's not only local. It can occur at the regional or even global scale, and it therefore requires knowledge and research and cooperation at these scales as well. Secondly, as Katie mentioned in the introduction, adaptation is not necessarily benign. Mitigation isn't necessarily benign either, but it's true that a unit of mitigation in any country does have benefits in all countries. But adaptation is different in that sense. Successful adaptation at a local scale can redistribute or exacerbate risk in another place. And for that reason, we need to analyze and cooperate around the planning of adaptation in a different way. Thirdly, adaptation to transboundary climate risk is currently falling between the cracks of risk ownership. It's currently no one's job, and therefore we need to not only analyze what the risks are, but also support the identification of who owns that risk and who should lead the planning and implementation of adaptation to it. And fourthly, in order to reframe adaptation at this global scale and embed transboundary climate risk in our adaptation plans, we need science and policy to address and adopt this lens, this transboundary lens, to take us forward on a systemic view of adaptation. some of what the brief does is it looks at what we currently know. Now, very briefly, awareness is rising, I would say, quite rapidly on this subject, particularly in the last 18 months. And as Katie said, partly as a result of COVID and what that has revealed about the nature of our world, but also just in the natural evolution of knowledge on this topic. And a lot more has been published and a lot of policy interest has been shown, especially in the last couple of years. We know a bit about the significance of these risks at a broad scale. Studies in both the UK and Germany have both claimed that these transboundary risks are an order of magnitude greater than the direct risks faced in both of those countries. And we've also begun to see evidence about the self-interest logic about why adaptation to transboundary climate risk would be effective. So, for example, there's been an economic modelling study that says if you factor in trade to global analyses of the impacts and costs of climate change, there's a cost benefit of investing in adaptation overseas, and that especially wealthy countries that would, under these modelling examinations, invest in adaptation in other countries, they actually get a positive payback for that because of the effects of trade and the nature of interdependence in a globalised world. But what don't we know? There's perhaps more that we don't know than we do. There's very little knowledge that's being collected on the transboundary effects of adaptation. So how adaptation that's planned in one country may positively or negatively affect countries elsewhere. We know very little about that. We know very little about how the costs of transboundary climate risk will be distributed among groups in society. The analysis has been at a very high level until now. So the groups that would be most affected, and perhaps the groups within whom the interest is to adapt, we don't know enough about that at the moment. And as I mentioned in the beginning, who owns these risks and where they sit both within the public government infrastructure, as well as different actors within the private sector, who ultimately owns this risk, and the division of responsibility between public and private actors for managing it is something that has not been analysed or discussed to a great extent yet. What are countries doing? The brief looks into this in a small amount of detail. A number of developing countries have mentioned transboundary issues in their national adaptation plans and strategies, often in the sense of the context within which adaptation happens, recognising the relevance of transboundary links and flows, less so in terms of identifying very specific impacts from climate change, although there is some, especially qualitative, content on the existence of transboundary climate impacts. And a number of more developed countries have undertaken national assessments and commissioned reports on this topic. And again, identifying potential impacts and risks, but very little planning of specific adaptation measures, and even less on who would be implementing or owning those adaptation actions. So what needs to happen? The brief puts out a number of suggestions. First, there needs to be a lot more dialogue, bringing actors together who are involved in managing these risks currently. And at the higher level, the reframing of adaptation, both as a global challenge, but also as a transboundary undertaking. And that reframing can happen both within the research field. It's important that the research and science that's done on impacts and vulnerability and adaptation adopts this lens, but also in the governance sphere. And so we need new knowledge, new research, but also practical guidance. And we need to move from the phase we're in at the moment, which is perhaps highlighting the existence of risk, towards a much more solution-oriented discussion about what can be done, what kind of cooperation is needed between certain stakeholders and actors to push this forward. So I'll end with another quote from the brief. The territorial approach that we currently adopt when we plan adaptation, both within the UNFCCC context, but also in the local and national context, is far from serving the national interest. And that, in fact, if countries just keep their eyes down and look at what will happen within their own borders, they're very likely not only to increase their own vulnerability by ignoring a set of risks that could be very important, but also to implement adaptation that can have very negative effects on their neighbours and potentially their allies and partners in other parts of the world. So that's a brief introduction to the topic. I look forward to your questions, and we'll pass on to the next presenter. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Magnus. A really comprehensive introduction there to transboundary climate risks and some of the key messages from the policy brief around the fact that adaptation is not just local. It can also be regional and global, and indeed might need to be in response to some of the transboundary nature of climate risk that we've seen, that it's not inherently benign. And so we really need to take a global outlook and think about what might be some of the ripple out effects of adaptation programs and policies. That adapting to transboundary climate risks is currently no one's job. And adaptation science should really be supporting the policy community to be more aware of these risks, but also to start assessing how we manage them. And we'll need much further discussion then around the solutions to governing and managing these sorts of risks. So thank you so much for that. Do, as I mentioned, keep your comments and questions and reflections coming in the Q&A or in the Q&A feature or in the chat box. We'd really like to hear what this makes you think, what this inspires. Do you agree? Do you disagree? How does this compare to your own experience? Do you recognize these sorts of risks? We'd love to hear your thoughts. So do post them and we'll turn to them during the Q&A session after we've heard from all the panelists. But I'd now like to turn to Prabhakar, who is a research manager at the Institute for Global Environmental Studies, or IGES, who has more than 15 years of experience in the fields of adaptation, disaster risk reduction, agriculture, food and energy in Japan and India. Prabhakar, we've heard from Magnus about what transboundary climate risks are, but what are some of the major gaps in our knowledge on these types of risk? Magnus talked a little bit about those, but we'd like to hear your further thoughts and reflections on the knowledge gaps and how you think that they could inform future research agendas, and also why does this all matter for adaptation? Prabhakar, over to you. Perhaps you're still on mute. Do we have you, Prabhakar?
Yes.
Okay. There we go. There you are.
Yes, thank you very much, Katie, and thank you to the organizers for giving me this opportunity of interacting with you. So as Katie asked, I'll be talking about the major transboundary climate risks in Asia, quoting some examples, and based on those examples, what are the gaps and the research needs that we have from the Asian context. So that's what I'm going to do for the next 8 minutes or so. So if you look at the Asia context, Asia is undergoing rapid regional and global integration. And it is very good that Asia is going through this regional and global integration. It has provided the Asian countries economic opportunity. It helped the countries to bring out millions of people out of poverty, provide gainful employment, and many other social and economic benefits. However, if you look at from the lens of transboundary climate risks, the regional and global integration is also putting the many Asian countries, especially the developing and those countries which have very limited capacity with regard to climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. These countries are being increasingly exposed to global risks. That we will look into how these countries are increasingly exposed to global risks, as well as many of the local risks are increasingly becoming globalized. So those are the two-way scenario that is happening because of the regional integration. This is the current overall regional scenario for the Asia. But if you look at the Asia Adaptation Gap Report of 2020, it clearly states that nearly 34% of the all adaptation solutions, they fall within natural resource management, as well as nearly 21% of the total solutions, they fall from within the agriculture sector. So this particular scenario is very much relevant for Asia as well, which has a predominant agriculture population. Agriculture is still a predominant share in the overall GDP of these countries. So we have certain solutions available, but only thing it's a matter of recognizing the transboundary risk in the adaptation planning. Now let us look at the individual context. So I have taken the 5 contexts here from the Asia region. One is Asian countries are rapidly growing in terms of the economic growth. And because of this, there's a lot of foreign direct investments coming to Asian countries. If you look at the Asian countries, totally, the foreign direct investments have nearly doubled since 1990. And if you total the foreign direct investments of top 20 Asian countries, according to the World Risk Index as well as Climate Risk Index, you will see that nearly 240 or 200 billion US dollars are invested in the 2016 year itself. In just 1 year, so much investment. In the same year, we see that nearly 1.5 to 51 billion US dollars economic losses were reported from the region, from the same number of countries. That means that there is a lot of significant amount of foreign direct investment going to some of the most vulnerable countries, depending on how you look at the vulnerability, whether it is a World Risk Index or Climate Risk Index. That's one point that we need to note. The second one is, which is a subset of the larger context I presented, which is a recent example of 2011 Bangkok floods. It has clearly indicated how much integrated the region is within the region as well as across the globe. The Bangkok floods prove that not only Bangkok and the Thai economy, but also Japan and beyond Japan, even countries like Malaysia, Vietnam, and Indonesia were also affected. And the global industrial production was negatively affected by 2.5%. But this is just one example at the regional level. And many countries, though they are trying their best to be food self-sufficient, I try to look at India's case of how it is dependent on food when it is importing food from other countries. And I'm really surprised to see that during 2011 to 2020, India imported nearly 42% of the total food imports from climatically highly vulnerable countries, according to this German Watch Climate Risk Index, and 29% politically unstable countries. That means that if India needs any kind of dependency it has on these food imports, anything that happens in these countries is going to negatively affect the food security of the country. And in turn, India is exporting a significant amount of food to many of these countries. That means that food export prospects of India is also highly volatile given this uncertain situation. Thirdly, we see that 2008 food price crisis, that is because partly was also discussed by Benzi as well. In that various factors seemingly unrelated to each other, they culminated within the same year that affected food security of the millions of the people in Asia. And we see that rice price has increased dramatically, putting millions of people food security in jeopardy. And these are because of the culmination of the both short-term factors as well as long-term factors, which I will not be dwelling in detail. And the fifth factor is there's a growing focus of the risk insurance. And if you look at the risk insurance, the way the risk insurance companies operate, they take the money from you and they invest in global markets because they need to earn money, and that's the way they operationalize their securitization or retrocession or many other credit default swaps and instruments like that. Though the Asian insurance market is not very well linked with global financial markets, the situation is going to change because the reinsurance industry in Asia is getting stronger, and the financial linkages of these companies with the international financial markets is also getting stronger. So any catastrophic event in Asia is going to affect the global finances as well. So this is something that that we have to look forward to, unless otherwise we want to make some preemptive changes to the system. So what is it telling us overall that we have seen that there is a limited recognition for adaptation as a regional or global good. And especially in some parts of the Asia, we have seen that there is a limited cooperation at the institutional level for risk information sharing among countries, exception being ASEAN and Mekong River Commission, which have established a very strong regional cooperation mechanism, but that's not the case with the many other Asian countries as well. And if you look at the climate risk assessments, they are still very much fragmented, very much sectoral, if you look at within the country, and there are no regional inter-country dependent risk assessments are available now. That means that the transboundary risk assessments are still not available in the Asian region. That means whatever the climate risks that these countries are estimating at the national level, they are largely underestimated. The risk is quite underestimated. So whatever the adaptation plans that are being drawn right now, they are not actually touching the overall adaptation needs of the countries at all. So this is something that we need to keep in consideration. So some of the policy, I'll just skip to the policy requirement for the region, given the time constraint. One big agenda that we are trying to promote is the regional cooperation within the South Asian region. And if we can pitch the idea for regional adaptation planning, that will help many countries to fill the current gaps in adaptation planning, even at the national level. So the regional adaptation planning should not be seen as an additionality, but rather as something that will complement the national adaptation planning, that will fill the knowledge gaps within the adaptation planning itself at the national level. So that is something that countries should look into and invest resources, come together, and put a framework for regional adaptation planning. So what does it will achieve at the end of the day is that it will help identify the research gaps and strengthen the research for assessing the climate risks, facilitate sharing risk information among all the countries, which is very much limited in many Asian countries, and further establish coordination mechanism among the countries to work on the adaptation solution. So I end here, and I'm looking forward to the discussions. Thank you.
Wow, Prabhakar, thank you so much for that whistle-stop tour of the context for transboundary climate risks in Asia, and for highlighting so well the benefits, but also the risks that has come through Asia's rapid regional integration. Some of the very real risks, and you illustrated those with some really compelling stories and statistics on the risks that countries in Asia could face as a result of their imports and exports, and the risks that travel through global supply chains, and the importance of accounting for risk insurance in this, and then also the need for us to think not only about national adaptation planning, but also regional adaptation planning as well. So there was a lot of information there. I hope it will start to kind of percolate as we continue to go. And as I said again, please do keep your comments and questions coming, and we look forward to picking up some further thoughts from you, Prabhakar, in the Q&A. Now, I'm really delighted to turn to Hannah Kanepan, who is a policy officer in the Sustainable Food Systems Programme at the European Centre for Development Policy Management, that's ECDPM, who specialises in adaptation within the context of Europe-Africa relations. Hannah, we've heard about the implications of transboundary climate risks, particularly within the Asian context. We've also heard about their implications for future research agendas. But what do we know about their impacts on people's lives and livelihoods? And what are some of the implications for adaptation programming and some of the knowledge gaps that would need to be filled to better equip adaptation practitioners to manage these risks in the future? And we're looking forward to hearing your thoughts on those questions in light of some of your research in Tunisia.
Okay, thank you, Katie. Welcome, everyone. So I will try to respond to these questions exactly by looking concretely at the case of Tunisia. We can go to the next slide, please. So, and then the next one. There are 3 parts. So first question, can you go to the next slide, please? So what are cascading climate risks to livelihoods? So just to avoid confusion, I'm talking about cascading climate risks, but this is nearly the same as transboundary climate risks that the other speakers used. So they are very complex, these cascading climate risks, as you already heard. So I will try to unpack them during my short intervention, and I will use the case of Tunisia as an illustration. Cascading climate risks can go into different directions. So first, let's have a look at the potential effects on Tunisia. The Transnational Climate Impact Index that was developed by Magnus, who just spoke, and his colleagues, uses 9 indicators of country-level exposure to cascading climate risks to rank countries. And one of these indicators is cereal import dependency. Now, in the case of Tunisia, this is quite important because the country is highly dependent on food imports. So according to research in 2010, Tunisia ranked 6th in the list of world's most important wheat importing countries. So if we go to the next slide, you see that there is a dynamic between international markets. So these are the countries from where Tunisia imports. These are most importantly Ukraine, but there is also Russia, France, the US. So climate impacts in these countries will have a spillover effect on Tunisia. So what could happen? A climate trigger could be increased variability in precipitation, reduced rainfall as well, can lead to drought, which we call in our Cascades project that Magnus also referred to during his presentation, an initial impact that can then lead to soil degradation, reduced freshwater availability. In turn, it leads to a reduction in crop yields of cereals, and for the case of Tunisia, this is particularly wheat. And that then has as a consequence reduction of export volume, price shocks. Now there is where these impacts cross the border. Tunisia, they could potentially lead to higher food prices. This will then create less market opportunities for people, reduction of income. People may want to choose to migrate to cities. Also due to higher food prices, the people are more reliant on subsidies coming from a state budget that is already under pressure. This will cause more strain on the provision of public services like water, energy, food. Also, there will be, in this case, less food security. And this combination of factors can cause instability, social unrest. So if we then go to the next slide. And yeah, okay, perfect. So then these cascading climate risks can also go into another direction. They can then in turn have what's happening in Tunisia can have an impact on, for example, Europe. So yes, then the next one to illustrate what I mean with this is that so the social unrest, instability in Tunisia could potentially have an impact on migration. So more people, because of the situation in Tunisia, may decide to look for other opportunities in Europe. It can also put pressure on diplomatic relations, which would be an important cause of concern for Europe because Tunisia is such an important ally in the region. And these are just 2 examples of possible effects. And yes, please go to the second part, because in my presentation, I don't want to talk about Europe. I want to take you back to the situation in Tunisia. So what are the implications now in Tunisia for adaptation programming? You can go to the next one. Given the high cereal import dependency, what could Tunisia do? So you could say a very straightforward response is build a buffer at home, build a stronger, diversified, environmentally sustainable national agri-food system, be less dependent on food imports. And this can be a way to adapt, but it's easier said than done. It's a technical solution that would make sense, but success of adaptation will depend on extreme complexity, on political economy factors. So you can only have success when adaptation solutions are embedded in locally owned transformation processes. And exactly these type of processes may be difficult in the case of Tunisia because of socioeconomic, governance, and political barriers. And I try to group these into 3 categories for the case of Tunisia. So the first one is poor, weak governance and policy incoherence. These are barriers for Tunisia's effective climate response. Concretely, this means that you have divided government coalitions, you have power of particular interest groups, you have the state's budget that is under that faces financial constraints, a weak institutional setup for climate action. I will talk a bit more about that in the next slide. So you know that a decade ago, the Tunisian revolution, sorry, we can still stay on this one, on the previous one. So a decade ago, the Tunisian revolution started, and in 2014, Tunisia adopted a new constitution, and climate change has become a permanent feature. And this is quite promising, but despite a strong need for adaptation in Tunisia, because including in its own agri-food sector, the climate response has been particularly emphasized in the energy sector, and not so much attention goes to adaptation. Now, a second barrier is that the national market and trade system is strongly geared towards the export of agricultural goods. Think of olive oil that goes to Europe, for which monoculture farming systems have been set up, and they deplete natural resources. They use a lot of the precious water in the soil particularly. This causes also soil degradation. So a lot of the land in Tunisia is being used for export-oriented crops, and that is a business and a political choice. And this also causes a lack of further building food self-sufficiency in the country. Then a third barrier is that climate risks are compounded by long-standing inequalities between the interior regions in the country that are, so the rural areas are very poor, lack of employment opportunities and so on there, and the affluent coastal areas. And so this is also marked by a continuous decline in employment opportunities in general, diminished agricultural livelihoods, particularly in these remote areas, despite political promises for more effective local governance. Yes, we can go to the next slide. This is one more. So what are the knowledge gaps and practical challenges given this situation? There are, so yeah, as already said by the previous speakers, cascading climate risks or transboundary climate risks, the whole thinking around it is rather new. So that also causes a lot of knowledge gaps. And I think the first one is the concrete question of how do you bridge science to policy to practice? As also written in the policy brief by Magnus and Katie, we're looking at empirical challenges of dealing with complexity. So the science looks at spatially dispersed risks. We're looking at forecasting, at scenarios, at things that could potentially happen in the future. There is a high level of uncertainty, and you also need a long-term approach. And this is basically not attractive to politics, especially political systems that are aiming for short-term gains, as is often the case in a country like Tunisia. So secondly, how do you coordinate the governance of cascading climate risks and adaptation at different scales, at different levels, and then on top of that with different types of actors? So the adaptation research and practice shows that it's extremely important to work at the local level. There is a lot of really good work being done on locally led adaptation. But again, for the specific situation of Tunisia, this is very challenging because although a decentralization process has started a few years ago, local autonomy is extremely limited. It has not been effective. This type of process and change may need much longer than a few years, but it's a huge challenge. And then looking at the national level, we see that climate change is not being mainstreamed throughout all ministries. There is also only one ministry that has a focal point of climate change. Then, as I already said, the climate response is mainly being emphasized in the energy sector. That you see the same when you look at the INDC of Tunisia. And then, so that's what's happening at the national level, but at the same time, coordination between this national and local level is also challenging. It's very top down. And then lastly, the regional level that previous speaker, Mr. Prabhakar, talked about, the importance of this regional approach. This is, as mentioned, so Tunisia is exposed to cascading climate risk through its supply chain. So it would make sense, it would be an option to work more with its direct neighboring countries. However, in North Africa, there are no strong regional networks, very little political coordination, very little market cooperation. So that also makes it an even bigger challenge, not only nationally within the country, but the fact that countries are often more competing than cooperating. And lastly, there is a big knowledge question around how do you ensure, no, please, once I'm just going to elaborate a bit on the last point on policy coherence. So I think I tried to explain that transmission of cascading climate risks will never be limited to one sector, as we saw also in the figure with all the interconnections. So rural-urban migration, it may be a result of climate change that is taking place, but there are other push factors. Now you have a lot of livelihoods, you have socioeconomic grievances, even human security concerns. So policy solutions should always tackle a very complex set of issues, not just environmental, not just climate, but you also need to involve social and economic measures. And these should all be coherent with each other. Okay, let me end there. If you want to know more about our work, you can go to Cascades website. And my presentation was largely based on a paper I wrote for Cascades. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Hannah, and thank you both to yourself and then also to colleagues at Terry for helping us navigate some of the technical challenges that are kind of those we commonly face today with so many of these Zoom calls. But thank you so much for taking us through this in-depth example in the case of Tunisia and the sorts of transboundary or cascading climate risks that it could face through its food imports and also some of them the implications that could have, the knock-on impacts in terms of its wider relationships with other regions and countries. And for highlighting some of the actions we need to take in terms of bridging this science policy practice interface, which is partly why we're engaged in conversations such as this one, but to really focus on this question of governance and ownership, and to think about how we manage and who has responsibility for managing these sorts of risks, and the important role that both cooperation can play in that internationally and regionally, but also coherence coherence horizontally across different sectors, but also vertically across the different governance layers, given that we're talking about cross-border issues. So thank you so much for those thoughts. And I'm delighted now to turn to Annette Mona, a team lead in the Adaptation Division of the Climate Change Secretariat, who's supporting the work of the Adaptation Committee. And Annette, we're really keen to hear from your perspective about some of the knowledge gaps that you feel would need to be filled to harness opportunities under the UNFCCC to better account for these sorts of transboundary climate risks. So we're all ears for the next few minutes. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Katie. I'm delighted to join you today and already add to the very interesting insights provided by the previous panelists. I don't have slides, but would like to take you to a few areas where I think those knowledge needs are very apparent and where the UNFCCC would indeed benefit from insights coming from the science area. Well, some of you have mentioned that adaptation is very much a local issue with, of course, transboundary dimensions. It's worth pointing out that parties in the Paris Agreement actually recognize that adaptation is a global challenge faced by all, with local, subnational, regional, and international dimensions. And further, not knowing how familiar you are with the agreement, it certainly established a cycle of ambition whereby parties would plan and undertake climate action, including adaptation. They would then report on it, and every 5 years, countries would get together and then collectively assess progress towards the joint goals and objectives they agreed upon. And in that cycle of ambition, I'd like to look at 3 areas where I think we need to hone in on transboundary risks. The first would be planning and implementing at the national level. The second would be reviewing your adaptation at the national level and then subsequently reporting on it. And then finally, I'd like to take it to the global level, where of course we would then need to review collective progress, including whether or not the adaptation we undertook was adequate and effective. So in terms of the first one, planning and implementing, we are all aware that in the agreement, all parties committed themselves to engage in adaptation planning and implementation, including to implement action and to assess climate impacts and vulnerability. However, if we look at what results in those plans and assessments, as already pointed out also by Hannah, it's not, transboundary risks are not always being taken into account. And one of the reasons is that if we look at the guidance for how to undertake these assessments and how to prepare those plans, including the national adaptation plans, transboundary risks do not necessarily feature. So the most we've seen is countries addressing regional risks, most often connected to joint resources, water resources, big rivers, water basins being examples. However, parties have by now realized that there is certainly a gap, and we've seen these transboundary impacts. Magnus highlighted some of them. Most recently, of course, we've seen the big boat being stuck in the Suez Canal and people talking that Europe would face a shortage of toilet paper. So it's everywhere, and it's relatively easy to understand. So the question is, how do we assess this? And we know there's a shortage of those methodologies. There is currently a call out by the Adaptation Committee, the principal advisory body on adaptation, to basically ask for new methodologies to better assess adaptation needs, so that those needs relate to action, but also to financial and technological support. And based on that, they would then prepare an analysis to basically say, okay, how do we assess adaptation needs? How can we apply what we have learned, and what also are the related gaps and needs? What further do we need to know, and can we draw some lessons learned and guidelines? And in that regard, the committee very much also welcomes case studies, including on transboundary. So that goes to sharing more knowledge as a first step. And already what we've seen is that if you look at the latest EU adaptation strategy published just last month, it does acknowledge that climate impacts have knock-on effects, and it vows to commit to strengthen cooperation and dialogue on adaptation. And in there, they do look at trade agreements, but of course, I mean, understanding it could be a bit broader, but it's promising that it catches up on the national level in terms of planning and implementation. That now brings me to the second aspect, which is the reviewing the progress made, but also reporting on adaptation at the national level. As you may recall, under the Paris Agreement, we have a number of reporting instruments through which parties can report on progress made. I would just like to highlight two of them. One of them is the adaptation communications, which was specifically established in Paris. And the goal was there to increase the visibility of adaptation, especially vis-a-vis mitigation, and also to enhance learning and understanding of adaptation needs and actions. And if you look at the elements of such a communication, it does include impacts, risks, and vulnerabilities, but also then how you would address any of those. And another important vehicle for reporting would be the biannual transparency reports. You could say that in the communications, you communicate upfront what you're planning to do, whereas the transparency reports basically would tell the others whether or not you have been successful, and if you haven't been successful, why. So both of these instruments are still relatively new. We've only received some 15 communications so far. The transparency reports will only kick in 2024. And for both of them, we're currently developing guidance material. On the communications, it's again the Adaptation Committee. And on the transparency reports, it's another expert group called the Consolidated Group of Experts. So there's scope for input from science and research, but also countries to basically say, okay, how can we better understand the risks, but also how can we better address them? So it's, and it has been acknowledged. So basically, it's a good time to share your research at this point. And then finally, the third aspect I'd like to highlight is what happens at the global level. And as part of the global stocktake, we will review the adequacy and effectiveness of adaptation. Basically, have we done enough? Are we now better adapted? But also, have we made progress towards the global goal on adaptation? And the global goal on adaptation is very aspirational insofar as it seeks to enhance adaptive capacity, strengthen resilience, and reduce vulnerability vis-a-vis the global temperature goal. You might note that we don't have targets or indicators. So it's one thing that each and every country would have to translate into its national context. However, whether or not we progress will be looked at a collective level. So we're currently facing a situation where we would get information from the national level, which we would then need to collate and aggregate to the global level. However, if we don't have accounted for any transboundary risks at the national level, it's likely they may be missed when we do the collective assessment. So again, it's being recognized that there is a gap, and the adaptation committee has been asked with looking at approaches for how to actually review the goal, particularly that we don't have the targets. And also their transboundary risk has been mentioned as an area that needs to be looked at more specifically. And the committee will host a webinar in early May on those aspects. And in that regard, I'd like to turn back to what Magnus said, that it's not that transboundary risks are no one's job. And everyone likes to compare adaptation to mitigation. And in a way, it's a bit like we're talking about international maritime and aviation emissions, which no one feels accountable for too, but they still count if we look at whether or not we reached our temperature goals. So we'll need to also make transboundary risk something that everyone feels responsible to. We need to assess it, but then of course need to look at who's going to address them, because whoever may take the action may not have the benefits, but nonetheless it shouldn't fall through the cracks, because if we don't address them, we'll never reach the goal. So in conclusion, I would say yes, the convention and the process is aware of it. However, it's not being adequately addressed. Not so much for lack of political will, but for a lack of awareness, but also a lack of methodologies and tools to, first of all, assess them, and then knowing how to address them, because it would require a lot of coordination so that you would open up your national plans and include a transboundary component. So in a way, there are many opportunities, and parties have committed to cooperating, including sharing information. And also the first global stocktake in 2023 certainly won't be the last one. And everyone agreed that it is a learning by doing exercise. So even if we won't account for them in the next 2 years, given all the developments, there's room for more. And of course, the more we learn and the more case studies we have, the better we can address it in the future. With that, thank you, Katie, and back to you.
Thank you so much, Annette. I'm very glad we're recording this, because I have a feeling I'm going to be rewatching that for the wealth of information you provided on all these opportunities and instruments and entry points for accounting for transboundary climate risk and the cascading nature of risk when it comes to planning and implementing at the national level, when it comes to reviewing and reporting also at the national level, but also when it comes to accounting for our global progress on the adequacy and effectiveness of adaptation at the global level, and assessing progress made towards implementing the global goal on adaptation. And really a call to action then in terms of coming up with these methodologies and tools to better assess, to better understand these sorts of risks, to identify them, to be able to measure and track them and understand their significance, and to really understand the impact they could have on people's lives and livelihoods. And I know that there's a question I've just seen already that's raised asking for more detail on this. So I'm hoping we can come back to that in the Q&A. For now, I'd just like to say thank you again to Annette, and just to turn to Reinhard Mechler, who is the lead of the Systemic Risk and Resilience Group at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. Reinhard, we're keen to hear from you about what do you think COVID-19 and the ongoing pandemic has taught us about the nature of risk, and what are some of the implications of these sorts of cascading risks for the global governance of risk, and what reforms you think might be needed to strengthen our ability to manage these sorts of risks in the future. So please, as our final panelist, last but not least, the floor is yours. And don't forget to unmute as well.
It is. Okay, you're taking time.
Perfect.
Thanks, Katie. Yeah, I'm excited to be in that meeting. Yeah, indeed, we have talked, colleagues have made great presentations on systemic and compound climate-related risk and what to do about this in terms of policy and governance issues. I wanted to quickly also go a little bit into the COVID space, an unhappy space. My thoughts are certainly with Indian and other colleagues, but it's also a space where that tells us we need to think about these multiple crises and more needs to be done about this. In the few minutes I quickly wanted to provide a bit of insight what we have done so far via this IASA, International Science Council, platform on pathways to a post-COVID-19 world, where the ambition has been, yeah, let's study and let's also support action on dealing with multiple risks and systemic risks. So I want to make a few comments in relation to governance, and let me just jump into the slides. This one is not from our initiative, but it's from the Cascades and the RECEID projects. Cascades is also supporting that interaction here. This is about systemic risk. What is that? These are triggering effects. These are direct effects or responses that lead to cascading impacts that cascade through networks in this globalized world that we're all living in. And I'm sure many colleagues from across the globe are participating here. So risks and impacts are cascading through citizen networks, to business networks, finance, policy, and governance. And you see that nicely identified in this chart here. Policy is somehow missing. I don't know, we forgot about this, so colleagues from Cascades and RECEID. But I think this nicely shows this issue about contagion, not the virus only, but other contagion effects. How do they spread across systems and borders, of course? So that's implied, as systems are largely also transboundary systems globally. That systemic risk, compound risk is somewhat related, but a bit different. And we have also seen that here, this thing from Nature Climate Change. Colleagues early in 2020 saying, well, there's quite a few hazards that are likely to happen as we will still be battling the COVID-19 crisis. And indeed, some of these have unfortunately materialized. The monsoon, for example, certainly this was, of course, to be expected, overlapped with the COVID crisis. And here you see colleagues that I work with in the Flood Resilience Alliance, trying to avoid the perfect storm in Nepal, putting up, for example, sanitation, ramping up the health systems, and really trying to work with this compound risk and really avoid that this becomes like totally existential. I think they've done quite a good job, but it's still ongoing, of course. So yeah, we had this IASA ISC initiative, and this was a consultation platform with many colleagues from across the globe. The narrative that we developed based on some background work has been that indeed we live in this world that is facing multiple and systemic risks that lead to inequality and sustainability. And there's an imperative to better govern and manage risk and build resilience long term. And I think all my predecessors speaking up also went into that space. So that's not totally novel, right? We've seen that also in the IPCC in the 2014 report, that indeed we got those multiple stressors that lead to risks. What we are faced currently with, and I like this why I put up the chart, we somehow have like a decision point. We talked a lot about this new normal and other opportunities for bouncing back. But yeah, it's certainly there's a massive crisis we're facing here in Austria, but also many other places. But can anything come out that leads maybe to that more climate friendly and more resilient world, so that we're all aspiring to? So that was a bit the background behind this initiative we had. We did a little pathway exercise to think about a number of things including global governance, multi-level governance, and national governance. So what can be done about this systemic risk and compound risks across nations and borders? Up came this nice little chart. So we identified a few options that may be taken forward. And so we did that last year, and this year we would like to take it forward and ground it and make it real and work further with policy, private sector, civil society, and research. Let me just identify a few of those, which may be interesting for debate. Here on global governance, the idea is there's ongoing UN reform. So Annette talked about UNFCCC, good stuff happening here, but then there's also debate about UN reform, international reform. In red, misspelled here, unfortunately, there's suggestions to think about institutional innovation to drive action, multi-stakeholder arrangements and coalitions. As one example, the Foundation for Global Governance and Sustainability in Brussels has been having dialogue around the Global Resilience Council, which would be complementing the Global Security Council and basically ramp up ambition and lead to somewhat like a decision-making or decision-supporting body that can indeed deal with those multiple crises, climate, pandemic, financial stuff, food and water. There's certain diplomatic avenues and fora under the UN. We also got the G20, but the impression is there could be or there should be need for like integrating it better and making it more actionable. So just as an insight, this is not promoted by me, but I just bring it up and it's interesting, I think. Multi-level governance, maybe that's a bit related to what Annette talked about also and what the WASP and the others are doing. We think we got great global reviews and on risk, for example, the Davos review that comes out regularly. But what's a bit missing, this multi-level risk and resilience assessment surveys and also dialogues that really links up to the most vulnerable and those that are most in need in need of further action on climate and other risks. So we think there could be an interesting opportunity here to take that forward. It's currently an ambition, an idea, but maybe it can be materialized. When it comes to national systems, here's a chance as we to revisit a bit, to put systemic resilience center stage and revisit a bit what resilience is. We think resilience should indeed also not only tackle the losses and the impacts, but it should also be forward-looking. So it's this notion of bouncing back, and this be taken forward into like building forward. Brings me to that quick suggestion on decision-making. Maybe that's interesting. Has been there for a while with ODI, LSE, and the World Bank. Can we think about this triple dividend decision-making? Indeed, avoiding the losses is paramount, number one, but unlocking socioeconomic potential as important, and then the co-benefits, can they also come in? This has been around, this suggestion has been around for a while. It's receiving a bit more interest recently with ADB, World Bank, and then also in Europe, DJ ECHO. Quick example from around closer to Delhi. We are doing some
Oops, I think we have lost Reinhard. What a shame, when he was just about to delve into, I think, a very interesting example there. Let's see if we can get him back. I'll just give him just a few seconds in case he's able to reconnect. In a moment, just to prepare our panel, and before we move to the Q&A, I'm just going to ask you for a super quick round of reflections. He's back. Right, Reinhard, we lost you just as you were about to launch into your the example.
Can you hear me at all?
We can hear you. We can't see you. Maybe you could turn your video off, and we can just. We can just about hear you. It's a little bit, it's breaking up a little bit. I don't know if there's a way to turn your video off and still share your screen.
Sorry, I'm back. Yeah, did you lose me in between? Sorry.
We did lose you, but I think you're back. So let's take that again. We lost you just as you were about to introduce this example. So perhaps you could take it from there.
Okay, super. Great. Okay, I thought you lost me all the way. Okay, but that's okay. It's not perfect. But let me try again very shortly. Then I'm done actually. So just yes, this idea about triple dividend and hard and resilience decision making. Like it's good to build the hard resilience type of options, but also nature-based solutions can lead the way. And you can link this up also to like village committees that think about like growing different varieties, so like crop varieties that can then also be sold in the market somehow. That's happening on the Nepali side, and it's complementing the work that is driven by Indian engineering and good engineering workforce. So it's just a little example, and that's only what I wanted to show. Do we need to think a bit more systemically about resilience and resilience building? And it's something that has been around for quite a while, of course, but here's a way maybe to bring it home. And that's it, quick promotional slide on our initiative, and will be great to further team up with many of you and be in touch. And that's it from my end. Thanks.
Thank you so much, and I'm so glad we managed to reconnect to just hear a bit more about that example at the end. Thank you for that introduction on how we manage or think about managing and strengthening the management of systemic and compound risks, for introducing us to this idea of an opportunity space, to take us through some options for reform of our global institutions, emphasizing the need for dialogue at multiple levels and between different governance levels of governance, for making systemic resilience and sustainability a core government priority, and then introducing us to that triple dividend decision-making framework at the end there. So thank you so much to our panel. We do have a few questions. By all means, keep them coming if there are other questions from the audience. I'm just going to now sneak in a quick question myself just before we turn to those three questions from the audience. And I'd just like to go through the panel super quickly again. I'm going to give you about 1 minute each, and that's it. But I'd just like to ask you to reflect on what you've heard from your fellow panelists. We had some really interesting and very varied inputs. And I'd just like to hear if you had to distill a single message that really struck you, that you will take away, maybe talk to somebody about, what would it be? And who in your ideal world would need to hear that message and why? So I realize that's a bit of a tall order, but I'm just going to ask Magnus first of all, and then we'll just go in order quickly, and then we'll turn to Frida to hear about the questions in the chat. Magnus.
It's hard to do in a minute. There's a few links between what people said, but one of the first ones, and I think it links what Prabhakar said with what Reinhard was talking about. Prabhakar identified the lack of institutions for sharing risk information, particularly at the regional scale. And then when Reinhard was going through some of the different suggestions from his report, this idea of a global resilience council, or even of just positioning systemic resilience as a core government priority, there's something there about how governments in particular disclose and share and access information about risk, particularly global systemic risk, that I think is very interesting. And it's also quite relevant to what Annette was saying about the global stocktake and its role in building systemic resilience. So I'd love to come back to that if we have time. I've got loads of others, but I guess I'm out of time.
Thanks. Thanks, Magnus, for respecting the time. I just want to make sure we get to the Q&A and have enough time to discuss those few questions. But yeah, there should be time for some further reflections on that later. And I agree that's a very important part of this discussion. Prabhakar, what struck you and why?
Well, thank you very much. Basically, my memory is very fresh with the triple dividend. I heard this triple dividend concept for a while, and I think it's catching up very much among especially the resilience interested community. I think, if you can make the triple dividend approach policy relevant suggestion, how do we operationalize this concept for specific policies? That would be fantastic. Yeah.
Thank you, Prabhakar. Hannah.
Yes. Well, it's not an easy exercise, but I think it was very positive to hear that transboundary climate risks are being integrated in the Paris Agreement. We see that also very strongly, as Annette mentioned, in the European Adaptation Strategy. So these are really, I think, especially for the new adaptation strategy, steps forward. And then a point that I think it was Magnus who said that if you include trade, then the cost-benefit ratio is higher on adaptation investments. And I think that here the Global Center on Adaptation did really wonderful research in showing that investments on adaptation can have much higher, like even up to 7 times the cost-benefit ratio. And I think this is a very convincing, also given the big adaptation gap that exists, very convincing factor. So yeah, I would recommend to really put a lot of attention on this. And yeah, let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah, for highlighting that. Yep. Indeed, and gives us lots of food for thought around the sort of the co-benefits that adaptation could realize and the wider ripple-on effects that could have in terms of transformational effects. Annette, do you have just a minute?
Of course. I think what struck me from the other presentations is how much research is actually being undertaken and the various insights we already learned. And I feel that it's always a question of having all that information at various levels, whether it's the projects or in research or very specific to a country, and then ensuring that this information reaches the actual decision makers or those people who then actually plan or report. So given that everyone is overwhelmed by information these days, how do we ensure that this type of information then reaches the right person? And I think that's an area that also needs to be looked at. Thanks.
I fully agree. And as somebody who spent most of their lives in communications, talking to loads of people about the need to think about our target audiences, I would fully agree. Fantastic. Reinhard, last minute from you before we turn to the Q&A.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, great. No, great inputs by colleagues. And I was particularly, particularly enthused by comments by Prabhakar and Annette about regional and global goods, right? Prabhakar talked about the regional good aspect of transboundary risk, which is obvious, but wasn't obvious to me. So it's something important. Yeah, so obviously that's good. And then Annette talked about the global goal and adaptation. I was confused about this. Why do we need it? Is this taking away from what should be done nationally and others? And of course it does, but with this transboundary, the systemic risk now proliferating, indeed, this global good, this may see some more attention, I guess. Of course, global could also probably mean a little bit regional, and so maybe some action, this could maybe organize action around what I also talked about, global governance and resilience governance. So maybe there's a chance to make this operational. So yeah, it was quite exciting. Yeah, thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Reinhard. Thank you to all the panel for keeping your interventions very short. And that means we've got about 20-25 minutes then to turn to, well, just have an ongoing conversation. And we'll turn first to some of the questions that we've received from the audience. We're going to ask all the panelists to keep your videos on. And if you'd like to answer a question, to just please just raise your hand when Frida talks about it, and Frida will then manage the next 20 minutes or so for you to make sure that you all have a chance to share your reflections. But Frida, welcome, and thank you for convening and coordinating this part. And can we hear what's been happening in the chat box and Q&A? What have you got for us?
Yes, thank you, Katie. And thanks all of you for really, really interesting talk so far. Yeah, I'm really happy to say that we have 3 really interesting questions. And please just keep asking questions if things show up during this part of the conversations as well. So the first question goes firstly to Magnus, but I would also love to hear from Annette and Reinhard. This question came just after your presentation, Magnus. Good evening from Japan, says Joshua Jodoin. Sorry for French pronunciation or a Japanese name. Thanks for putting this on. Question: as was discussed in the intro, transboundary climate risk as an issue is currently no one's responsibility. Whose responsibility should it be? And shouldn't the UN be playing a bigger role? Magnus, what do you think?
I think that part of the comment about it being no one's responsibility is that it currently doesn't really fit the adaptation brief as it's defined today. So adaptation evolved often out of the environmental sciences, had a very territorial framing, and it's been a multidisciplinary effort between natural science, engineering, spatial planning, and so on. Very territorial disciplines, both in the science, but also in the policy domain, about an area that's under control and the physical risks that climate poses and how that's been managed. Often adaptation strategies are coordinated by environment ministries, which tend to be staffed by people with environmental and natural science backgrounds. And this more systemic, more international, more trade dimension of risk doesn't tend to fit those academic and evidence disciplines. And also the stakeholder groups that have been formed to coordinate adaptation are often within territorial ministries. They generally don't tend to involve foreign affairs, trade, business, finance, as much as they do flood, food, agriculture, health, and so on, which is much more territorial. But there's something in what's come out of the discussion since my presentation that I think is maybe worth touching on here. I found it very interesting what Hannah said about adaptation works at the local level, and adaptation can often be quite an abstract undertaking, and it needs to be rooted in something quite concrete in order for it to really be implemented. And that kind of local level, especially with nearer term agenda, works well. So the question is getting to how can the strategic nature of transboundary climate risk be owned, particularly within central government, I think. And I think that this is currently a gap in the government architecture, and this is what Reinhard was getting at, I think, is that resilience as such, including climate resilience, needs to become a new objective of government. And the risk society that we live in, a world of increasing systemic risk, interconnected and complex risk, needs to have a bigger place, risk management, within the central government architecture. So in most countries, that function doesn't exist, especially with regard to external risk. External risk is often managed by the military or the financial aspects, often in the finance ministry. But many governments have struggled to create a permanent home for foresight and strategic risk management. So it's that function, it doesn't have to be climate specific, that I think in most countries is missing. I think the first step is to create sort of initiatives or steering committees to look at transboundary climate risk. But in time, we're not pushing against the tide. The tide is also pushing for central governments to be more risk literate and to take a more strategic approach to managing risk. So transboundary climate risk may in the future belong in a strategic risk management function within government.
Thanks, Magnus. Annette, did you have anything to add on this question? Do you want me to repeat it? Just tell me.
Sorry, I first need to find the unmute button. I would actually respond to the following questions. I think, as I mentioned, in terms of the transboundary issues, it's not so much for a lack of political will of really excluding it, but for a lack of awareness. And I think in the coming years, the UN will play a bigger role in it.
Yeah, perfect, great. I don't know, Reinhard, if we lost you. I can't see your video anymore.
Still there, right? Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah, can I make a quick comment here? This question, yeah, seem to be agreement, transboundary global risks need better governance. But we have something, right? There is stuff. So I think we're not starting from scratch, but we see it, for example, if you look into the pandemic, WHO can be debated, but here's institutions that step up to global challenges. In Europe, we've also done it. I'm sure in Asian countries, it's also happening. In the financial crisis, can again be debated forever, but I think also here certain institutions also try to step up. So that's more like maybe at state, multi-state or multilateral levels. If you look into more practical management of like climate-related risk. We got the Transboundary river commissions. We got all these delta commissions, right? Mekong, Europe, Rhine, and so on. So there's stuff to build on, and it's the evidence is actually it's not so easy to set this up. These bodies, there's quite some competition and some conflict also when they're being set up, but they can be set up, and some of those, and I'm not an expert here, seem to work quite well. At global levels, we got a little bit like maybe, excuse my framing, but maybe talk shops. So we got this like the ECOSOC, so Economic and Social Council, high-level political forum for sustainable development, and then the Human Rights Council. So that's not bad, that's good, but it's not so actionable, right? And the G20 is probably also doesn't have really teeth. So indeed, it could be interesting to consider something like this Global Resilience Council. And I was in one of these meetings, and they had some high-level types, ex-UNFCCC deputy lead people. I'm not putting names out, but they seem to have people that know this global context much better than I do. But yeah, glass is not full, but it's not fully empty. So there's something to build on and to look further into. Thanks.
That's great. Really interesting to hear. Prabhakar, I was unsure if you were waving your hand, but you're nodding a lot, so maybe you want to add something anyway.
This is a kind of a typical question we tend to ask for every issue. Who should be made responsible? But you know, if you look at the environmental history of global environmental conservation, the pinpointing of responsibility has not played out well in the global management of the global good, and we realize that the responsibility should be rested with everybody. Maybe somebody is responsible for coordination, somebody is responsible for monitoring, information sharing, but the responsibility should be with everybody. And of course, everybody has various degrees of responsibilities. So I think that that's a kind of learning I would take from the environmental history of the world to the transboundary climate risks as well. Probably we may pinpoint the responsibility to National Commission on Climate Change, but then ultimately they are going to develop guidelines on how to screen projects that will not exacerbate the transboundaries, for example. So that means that the responsibilities are going to be ultimately trickled down to individual actors. So I think we should move towards that paradigm. So that's going to be more effective rather than pinpointing one agency for being responsible. Thank you.
Thank you, Prabhakar. Really, really important question, responsibility. Thank you for that from the audience. So the next one is about well, assessments and how do you work with cascading climate risks. It showed up during Hannah's presentation, so I want to turn to you first, and I know Annette, you want to answer to this too. And I'm guessing maybe Magnus and potentially Prabhakar has something to say about this, but just wave your hand if you want to talk. So Lorena Martinez asks, how do you assess or identify the cascading climate risks beyond borders? Do you have a tool that can guide users or policymakers to identify and analyze them? And I'm thinking, or maybe it's just from my personal perspective, I'm really curious about this kind of local perspective that you have, Hannah, in the things that you presented. How do we how do we do research that matters for the local context as well?
Okay, well, I think, yeah, talking about assessments, scientific assessments, that's, I think, still a big knowledge gap. I think Annette mentioned that also within the UN system, that currently methodologies and tools to measure impacts or transboundary impacts are lacking. I think with we are trying to address this with the Cascades project and also with RECEIT, where we are looking at what are climate impacts on production in certain countries, what are the impacts on trade, supply chains. So we're trying really to, in these projects, cover this. Now the question on the local level, I'm not sure if I understood well what type of assessments. Can you maybe repeat the question on specifically for
Absolutely. So the question is, how do you assess or identify the cascading climate risks beyond borders? Do you have a tool that can guide users or policymakers to identify and analyze them?
I'm not sure if I'm well placed, because this is, to me, quite a scientific question. So as I said, this is more the science part of the Cascades and the RECEIVE project addressing this. I think currently in the case of Tunisia, there is not such type of tool. I think they're really what I presented are potential future impacts that should be taken into account by a country like Tunisia. That was only an example. So I don't think they have at this point, there is this very strong awareness, but what we see is of these potential impacts that could happen in Ukraine or Russia. But what we see is that there is a movement within Tunisia that wants to work towards more food sovereignty, food self-sufficiency, and the same, we have similar movements in countries in the Western Sahel, because they want to be less dependent on food imports and the possible price volatility and price shocks that are related to this high level of dependency. So, and I think that's very important to have these civil society movements, grassroots movements that are working in countries, but for them to have an impact, that's the main challenge. And for this, it's really important to understand the political economy barriers that exist within countries. And I think just to give an example is the fact that climate is you have only one focal point within the Ministry of Water. It's also a point that Magnus made, that often this is the responsibility of just one small ministry. It's not fully mainstream throughout all the entire government. You have also climate plans. It's very important to look at this within countries. What is the focus on? And if there is not a general political willingness to build resilience, to invest in that, also own resources, domestic resources, not only relying on international adaptation finance, then it will be very difficult, I think, to have an impact. Thanks.
Thank you, Anna. It's great to hear. Annette, did you have some specific points on the research question? No. Reinhard, I see your hand. Yeah.
As alluded to, yeah, so the RECEIVE and Cascades projects indeed try to come up with like a toolkit and methods that should inform this a bit novel question. But of course, if the contagion propagates through market-based systems, right? So we got tools, of course, so like agricultural market modeling, or even like input-output modeling, global modeling, and that has been around for quite a while, and could be put, yeah, to use here, agent-based modeling and stuff like this. So we have things available. Whether they are perfectly fit and whether they're easily usable by policy people is another question. But yeah, our projects is promotional, but they try to go in that direction. We study stuff in Africa or like in Latin America. How do risks affect Europe, and what can Europe do about those risks? So that could help a bit to inform that space. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Reinhard. Magnus?
Just very briefly, it might be useful to very briefly describe the approach of those two projects and encourage anyone who's listening or watches this back to look at the RECEIVE and Cascade websites. But basically, the Cascade approach is to look at the current links and flows between Europe and countries outside Europe, and to do some sort of overview of how those links and flows might change in future. And then to look at how climate change in other parts of the world that the EU is linked to might affect those links and flows. And it does that by predefining certain sectors that are of interest. One is trade, and using different kinds of supply chain data and trade modeling to do that. One is foreign affairs and development, in particular hotspot regions near Europe and Europe's neighborhood. And the other is finance, so climate risks propagating through the financial network using existing financial modeling techniques. As RECEIVE uses a very interesting approach based more on storylines, so plausible sort of chains of events that could occur and describe the way that climate impacts cascade from places outside Europe into Europe. And both, so slightly different approaches, both using existing methods but innovating them to undertake novel risk assessments. So those are just examples, and I think there are gaps still in our toolkit of how we assess risk. And if you base things on the current links and flows between places, then might miss the emergent or novel risks that haven't been seen before. So it's very much an open question, but yeah, just to encourage people to look at Receipt and Cascade project websites if they want more information.
Thanks, Magnus. That's also great clarification. Next entry that in the chat is halfway is a call out and a question as well. So Jonathan Casey of the CABI is wondering how much of panelists consider the impacts of invasive pests and plants in transboundary risks. The way I'm familiar with your work, I don't think anyone is specifically targeting this. I see heads doing the opposite of nodding, whatever that is in English. But Johnny Casey of the CABI is reaching out to if anyone would be interested in talking more about that. Yeah, I don't see any hands. Yeah.
Perhaps I can just say that what maybe Magnus was going to say something and I would welcome his inputs, but just to say that we've been meaning to reach out to you guys from the Adaptation Without Borders partnership for a while to connect. So apologies that we haven't yet done that, but I'm really looking forward to connecting in the near future and certainly after this webinar. So thank you for the reminder, and we'd be really, really like to hear more about your work on that. Magnus, were you going to say anything different?
I was going to say thank you for raising that. I think when we first started to characterize different transboundary climate risks, we identified 4 climate risk pathways. One was trade, one was finance, one was people, and the 4th was biophysical pathway, which included climate-affected flows of natural resources across borders. The most obvious example is transboundary rivers, but it includes oceans and air currents, and invasive species was always included in that category, but we haven't developed any indicators of risks via that specific pathway, the invasive species, I mean, nor have I seen any examples personally. So it'd be very good, it's a very important dimension of risk in modern agricultural food systems and for biodiversity. So it's very important to look at it, but no, I'm not aware of any work that has. So hopefully we can keep that conversation going. Thank you.
Thank you, Magnus and Katie. And I'm personally very happy to see that there's networking being made in this online format, which is otherwise one of the most difficult challenges, I think. So the last question, and we have about 8 minutes or so to talk about this, is a really good and interesting one. And now I don't have any specific person, so anyone who wished to speak on this. Sorry, now I lost yes, I already see him. Now I lost the chat for 2 seconds. So Stephanie Pierce wonders, how do you link with the investment sector financing for the consideration and for addressing these transboundary risks? I see Annette.
Yes, because I realized there has been another question from Martin. I don't know whether, because I see that in the all panel and in mine, and I would like to address the question of who's responsible and why do we have a global goal on adaptation. I think it's important to have such a global goal because it links 2 things. On the one hand side, it links developed and developing countries, knowing that developed countries through their emissions have more or less borne the main responsibility for the impacts and are obligated to support developing countries. But also it links the need for adaptation with the success or lack thereof of mitigation, because the global goal on adaptation is tied to our success of limiting global warming. So it's an important benchmark to see whether or not we're doing well. It may not be the best signpost for what you do at the national level, but it's important collectively to know whether we're supporting adaptation sufficiently. And that also is mirrored in the principle of equity, which runs throughout the Paris Agreement and the global stocktake, and that there is a link between climate change actions, but also equitable access to sustainable development, which then brings me to who should be made responsible for the transboundary risks. Of course, first of all, we need to assess them, and we talked a lot on how to assess them, so that we need to support those who cannot assess by themselves to actually do such an assessment. To what extent are they vulnerable from transboundary risks? And then in a second step, you would look at how to address them. Is it sufficient to address them at a national level, at a local level, or do you indeed need to cooperate with others? And then, while this seems all very daunting, I would also like to say that in a way, transboundary risks are not new. We're now looking at the climate aspects of them. But in the past, a lot of research has been done on commodity-dependent economies, and where the higher their share of their primary goods, of course, the more vulnerable they are to commodity price shocks. And now we bring in the climate shocks component of it. And we've seen a lot of success with some of the economic diversification plans and policy, either within a supply chain or across. So I would also would like, when we try to address those risks, to look at other policy fields and how transboundary risks have been addressed there. And then finally, the question of response measures. Some of you may be familiar with that concept insofar as the convention says that countries, when implementing climate action, would need to look at any negative effects it has on others. Traditionally, that was very much in the realm of oil-producing countries who felt that they would have negative effects if everyone does mitigates. But now, of course, we could also look at, are there any negative impacts from adaptation in one country that then trickles down to another one? So I think there's room, and we have processes to look at response measures where it would be important to bring those aspects too. And with that, back to you.
Thank you, Annette. Yeah, I think there's a way to send secret messages that I can't see to specific people. So that's what you got here. On this question on investment sector and financing, Magnus, I see that you want to speak.
So there's a growing amount of evidence on the ways in which climate risk will propagate through financial networks. There's been some very interesting studies done that look at the characteristics of different economies and different investment portfolios and model how climate impacts might spread through markets and financial networks. And there's measures underway in the private sector to disclose more information about risks, which are partly driven by investors. So the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure is a kind of framework and a set of recommendations to encourage and structure company reporting on climate risk, both transition risk, but also the physical risk from climate change, so the adaptation sort of category of risk. But there's a need for much better informed dialogue on the management of climate risk by investors and financial actors, because that falls in the category of adaptation that can be maladaptive or at least have a strong justice component. So it might be effective for an investor to withdraw from a risky market, a market that's becoming much more risky as a result of climate change, but that might have quite severe implications for people livelihoods dependent on the assets that have been divested from. So there's a strong justice element. There's a paper that Frida and her colleagues released recently on the just transition for adaptation and what that should look like and why that matters from a global perspective, looking at transboundary climate risk. And the financial investment community is one area where much more dialogue is needed on how climate risk is managed and what the justice implications of that are.
Thank you, Magnus. I'm gonna, Reinhard, you get like half a minute because then I have to give the word back to Katie in the Q&A session. But you get the final words of the Q&A.
Oh, that's great. I know it can be very short. Yeah. So obviously, global markets or finance, investment, insurance by definition is dealing with that. This can be market-based, can also be like can be social or sovereign insurance. So there's a lot of stuff happening that tackles that. This may be a good avenue. I'm not talking about developing markets, but thinking about other solutions. And then commodity markets were mentioned by Annette. There has been lots of interest. And then real estate is popping up. So like they investors may be invested in places that are increasingly being affected by sea level rise. So they're seeing also the need for taking action. And that was maybe a little bit more than half a minute. Thanks. Over to Frida.
That's great. Thank you so much. I also see that there is some specific targeted questions showing up in the chat now from to Prabhakar and that you already answered. Yeah, but keep going in the chat. Go ahead over to Katie again. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And yes, sorry that there was a couple of technical issues. I don't think we could see all of the questions come in from the chat. So really grateful if the speakers and panelists do see any questions that we haven't quite covered, please do take a couple of minutes to answer them in the chat. And while I turn to our next speaker, just for a few minutes of remarks, he might well have something as well to say on the role of international agreements for helping further the agenda for transboundary climate risk governance. But yes, I'd just like to thank our panelists and particularly my colleague Frida Lager there, who's a research associate at SEI, for convening that conversation. And we're just going to turn now to Richard Klein, who's a senior research fellow at SEI and member of the science committee of the World Adaptation Science Programme, who has the unenviable job of distilling this rich and wide-ranging discussion into three key implications for three key takeaways for the World Adaptation Science Programme. Richard, you've got 5 minutes.
Thanks very much, Katie, and let me first thank the 5 panelists for an incredibly rich conversation. I really enjoyed listening to the presentations, and I think it shows to everybody attending this event that transboundary climate risk have come a long way, and that there are many research questions, but also many policy implications that need to be considered. And that's what I'm going to try to do now. I'm wearing my hat of a member of the Science Committee of the World Adaptation Science Programme, who are co-hosting this series of events. And it strikes me from listening to the presentations and the discussion that there are really sort of three key core questions that will need to be addressed. And if you want, you can see those as my takeaways. But I'll go in a little bit further detail as to what that means. But I think from a research sort of prioritization perspective, which is what the World Adaptation Science Programme intends to do, the three key questions are, first and foremost, what are those transboundary climate risks? Do they matter? Can we quantify them? What are the patterns and the pathways? And it looks like there is an increasing amount of research being done on that particular topic. And we've seen various results of that. Clearly, the work of Hannah and also Magnus, that sort of points at case studies, also Prabhakar, case studies of how these transboundary climate risks emerge and the diversity of these risks and how they cascade across sectors. The second key question is then what options actually exist to address those risks. Hannah gave an example of, could a country, for example, prepare for food insecurity by improving the storage capacity within countries. There was a discussion about regional collaboration. What is the role of risk sharing and insurance? I think much less is known about the options and how they and when they and by whom they would best be implemented in order to reduce the risks. And the by whom, I think, is the third question. Magnus raised this, and there was a lot of discussion about this. Whose responsibility is it to manage transboundary climate risks? So in other words, once you have an understanding of the transboundary climate risks and you have an understanding of the options that you could use, then whose role is it? Whose job is it to start implementing those? And this is, I think, a really interesting conversation that is really complex because it has local and national elements to it. There is the regional and global aspects, The EU adaptation strategy now includes, that came out in February this year, has a very interesting section on international aspects of adaptation and transboundary climate risk as part of it. And it also introduces this notion of just resilience that Magnus just mentioned. It also links to the role of the private sector, which we haven't talked so much about, but of course they are also very much an actor in those supply chains and in other aspects that we're talking about. You know, is the private sector going to see this simply as an externality that is going to be passed on to consumers, in which case things will simply become a little bit more expensive for all of us? Or are they going to take also some of their responsibility, for example, towards just resilience and making sure that those losing out at the beginning of a supply chain, if there is going to be, say, an adjustment, how they lose out, and if they are going to be compensated, so the equivalent of a just transition for mitigation. When it then comes to sort of developing a research agenda or research priorities, the cross-scale nature of that needs to be really reflected in this. Clearly, we're talking about this being a global challenge. This is what Annette said, and the Paris Agreement makes it very clear. At the same time, there are implications at all levels. It may well be that a global process causing transboundary climate risk will have very significant impacts at a local level, in which case locally led adaptation will also need to consider those transboundary climate risks that are being imposed on them by no fault of their own. So this sort of leads to the question, do these regional or global pathways that lead to transboundary climate risk also always need regional and global collaboration and coordination in order to address them? I think it's going to be an important part of it, but let's not see this as something separate from what is happening within countries at the local and subnational level. There is an important element there to do with the costs and benefits, the cross-border costs and benefits of those risks and of adaptation to those risks, which needs to be better understood. And I think that also points to the importance of really expanding the set of disciplines and the expertise needed to be able to address the three questions that are raised. Perhaps even more strongly than before, we need to talk about governance, we need to talk about politics and geopolitics, we need to look at trade, we need to look at economics, we need to look at security issues. I see Kate becoming very, very nervous, so I will cut this to a close by saying that thank you again for all these presentations. This is extremely useful to the World Adaptation Science Programme, which is also uniquely placed to make sure that the research that you're doing and that others are doing is not only being prioritized, but also reaches those that actually can benefit from it. And that is because the World Adaptation Science Programme is governed by a number of organizations such as the UNFCCC, the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environment Facility, UNEP, and others. Thanks again, and thanks very much, Katie, for keeping us on time.
Thanks so much, Richard, and for setting us all kind of lots of homework or clarifying our task list as we go forwards on this exciting agenda, and for really that inspiring closing remarks. Unfortunately, we don't have time to turn again to the panel, so just in the last 2 minutes, if any of you wanted to put any final comments or questions, please do so in the chat. Before I hand over to the Adaptation Futures 2020 Secretariat to draw the webinar to a close, I would like to say a personal thanks to all our panelists and to all the guests who've joined us online. In terms of next steps, we're really looking forward to continuing these conversations at Adaptation Futures later this year. And in the meantime, if you'd like to stay involved and engaged, please do sign up for newsletter updates on the Adaptation Without Borders website, where we also have a host of resources on cascading and cross-border climate risk. Or you can drop me a line. My email address is on the SEI website. And do follow at Adapt Futures for the recording of this and for the sharing of the brief and for further resources. Dietri, over to you.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you so much. I, on behalf of the Adaptation Futures Secretariat, would like to thank all of our speakers for the very rich discussion that we witnessed today, and our attendees for actively taking part in it. And we would also like to thank our donors and sponsors for their continued support in the run-up to the conference in October. And please do follow us on our social media handles to know more about upcoming webinar series and the conference. Thank you very much, and stay safe, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.